Hey everyone, Pugs here with two new reviews for y'all. Today I'm covering A Life in a Day and Sun Bleached. These are two episodes that just feel like they belong together, maybe because they both feature Goo Lagoon. Actually, I think that's exactly why, since I get a big summer vibe from both of them. It's unfortunate that the two episodes don't match each other in quality though. Oh, was that a spoiler? I mean, y'all did see what's replacing the closing thoughts of this video, right? That should tell you perhaps all you need to know about Sun Bleached. But I digress. I'll get to that when I get to that. I'll just put a pin in that discussion for now, so I can say, as always, thank you to everyone watching the video today, especially thank you to everyone who leaves comments because I love to see them. And now, let's just get right into it. Starting things off today is A Life in a Day, which is probably one of the more well-known episodes of Season 6 that isn't infamous or notorious or anything of the sort. And this is great because I like when episodes have a positive reputation. Well, maybe the reputation for this episode isn't particularly positive, but people know the living like Larry line, and that's good enough for me. And relevant fun fact about me, but I have a Living Like Larry sticker on my laptop, the very laptop I use to write my scripts and record and edit my videos, the very laptop I'm using right now. Alright, first things first, let's give it up to A Life in a Day for bringing Larry back to us. It's been way too long since we'd last seen him, which was in Roller Cowards. Larry's always been a fun character to me, so it's great to see him again here. This episode also marks the return of Goo Lagoon, which has been similarly absent from the show for a bit. And I suppose that these two things being absent are connected, given that Larry is a character who, until more recently, had been strongly associated with Goo Lagoon. Also, with the return of Goo Lagoon, we see a lot of surf rock songs in this episode, which harkens back to season 1, although the kind of surf rock songs used in that season were a bit more downbeat and chill. I also think the songs in this episode really help with the atmosphere. The little stunt show at the beginning of A Life in a Day is fine. It's not particularly funny or amusing, but it does give us some insight into Larry's character, so I'll give this sequence that much. And then when Larry gives his whole missive about living large and YOLO, at first I'm slightly, perturbed by how he picks on SpongeBob and Patrick for no reason, but as the scene goes on, it gets kind of funny with the visual gags and the way that the townspeople just drag SpongeBob and Patrick's names, through the mud. Sometimes Bikini Bottomites can be complete and utter assholes without it being annoying. Only sometimes, though. The concept of this episode is an interesting one to me, being a kind of serious topic that is completely turned comedic, as is this show's style. I mean, this episode is basically about a midlife crisis mixed with the social expectations of living in your 20s, which is demonstrated when Patrick is like, "These are the best years of our lives and we're wasting them." From this setup, the episode becomes mostly filled with gags for a while, with all of Patrick's attempts to live life to the fullest. His utter seriousness in doing this is hilarious to me, especially in that first scene where he jumps in the air saying, "Living like Larry," all dramatically. Like, that was just hysterical. From there, the scenes and gags vary in their humor quality, but they're all at least a little bit funny to me, with some just being utterly hilarious. And of course, they're all fun to watch too. I really like the way this episode juxtaposes SpongeBob's slow-going, low-life-risking, stakes lifestyle with Patrick's new extreme, risky choices, and I love how SpongeBob has no insecurity in this, at least at first. Eventually, SpongeBob succumbs to peer pressure, and I both like and dislike how subtle the episode is about this. It could have been more blatant about getting that point across, but also the subtlety is nice. Same thing with the subtlety of Larry being wrong about at least SpongeBob. SpongeBob was perfectly happy with his life until Larry and then Patrick planted seeds of doubt in his mind. But anyway, it was nice to see SpongeBob enjoy his safe life with its quote-unquote small thrills. I think that there's a lesson to be had there about finding joy in the smallest things and enjoying what life has to offer and what it has already given you rather than chasing a new high. Again, all of this is subtext, but I choose to think this subtext is intentional. In fact, it's gotta be intentional. Like, I love how Patrick gets increasingly maimed by all of these reckless activities he's doing, showing that he isn't immune to the dangerous disregard for his own life that he's displaying here. The car dump scene is low-key kinda dark for showing exactly this. His hysteria and excitement over these dangerous activities really help to make the scenes even more entertaining for me, especially when juxtaposed with SpongeBob's outlook. And I like how eventually SpongeBob tells Patrick what Larry will be telling them at the end of the episode. This turns out to be one of the last bits of enlightenment from our little friend in this episode, as eventually SpongeBob gets bit by the reckless bug too. The turning point of this episode is when Patrick runs away from the bikers. I love how we can see the switch in both Patrick and SpongeBob here as Patrick starts preserving his own life, and SpongeBob starts to buy into what the best friends believed Larry meant. I love how SpongeBob is able to talk everyone down until he accidentally knocks their bikes over, and then the adrenaline gets to his head. It's great, with some funny jokes in there too. One thing I really like about this episode is that it kind of subverts expectations by having Patrick actually stop trying to live extreme after he takes things too far, and at the same time the dynamics switch as SpongeBob gets into it and starts getting into even more dangerous and reckless behaviors than even Patrick. In doing this, this episode also avoids being too similar to pre-hibernation week, though I was never quite worried about that in the first place. This switch works wonders for A Life in a Day, as the switch makes the ending segment so much more entertaining for me than it would have been if it was Patrick's idea to shoot them all into an island of spikes. Not to mention, strengthens the message about how being dissatisfied with your life because of pure expectations can be disastrous. And speaking of the ending, I like the reappearance of Larry here as he gives voice to the ultimate lesson of the episode. The way Larry and Patrick start freaking out while SpongeBob doesn't is utterly hilarious, and the very ending of the episode in the hospital is great, with Larry ready to seriously hurt SpongeBob even more than he already is. Maybe you should have just kept your mouth shut, Larry. A Life in a Day is yet another really fun episode that I've got no problems with at all. It's got some really funny moments in there, and when it isn't funny, it's engaging, action-packed, and all-around entertaining. I also really like how this episode has a message about how you might want to live your life. It feels like a proper pair with Slide Whistle Stooges, which has that same undertone as episodes like Squidville and Idiot Box about the benefits of adding fun, imagination, and whimsy to your life. Definitely a worthy addition to my amazing tier, where it comes in with a score of 9.2 out of 10. If you couldn't already tell, this review is going to be a little different from my other reviews on the basis of the fact that one of the main thoughts I have on this episode won't be mentioned until after the review ends. And that's because I've got problems with Sun Bleached. Major problems. Major soapbox problems. So much so that I had to put them after the main review so the actual review would not get lost in those weeds. Y'all know I'll never back down from an opportunity to get on a soapbox, and since I've got problems with the entire plot of this episode, I'm gonna make it everybody else's problem, you hear? But before I do that, I'll give my typical review. Sun Bleached begins quite interestingly, with SpongeBob acting as Patrick's beach towel. This was an interesting joke. I think that's all I'll say on that. This initial scene kind of reminds me of the Inmates of Summer with the way that Patrick runs onto the scene. However, after the setup with Craig Hamilton, Sun Bleached becomes kind of boring, and the only thing that really keeps my interest are the burning issues I have with the entire plot, which isn't exactly a good sign. I did like the little bit with the sunscreen, but it wasn't all that funny, and after that, for the next few minutes, I failed to be thoroughly entertained. Well, I will say that the 80s commercial was quite fun. However, that fun goes away very, very quickly once we move to the predictable plot of Patrick completely forgetting about SpongeBob. Not only is this plot annoying in its predictability, but it's also annoying because, as we all probably know by now, I get no enjoyment from watching Patrick be a shit friend. Patrick and SpongeBob's friendship is at its best when they are ride-or-die supportive best buddies. That doesn't mean they have to be the best influence for each other, or that they can't make mistakes, but it does mean they have to have the other's well-being and best interests in mind, which Patrick does not here. That's what makes something like this a shitty plot, but something like Patrick misguiding SpongeBob and Tea at the Tree Dome endearing and enjoyable. The second reason I don't like this part is because instead of doing literally anything else to make Patrick forget or be preoccupied, they pull some weird heteronormative garbage that pulls me right out of the show because y'all know I hate this shit. And I'm probably more upset than usual because of the pre-existing episode or issues I already have with this episode, but I've said this before in my reviews of That's No Lady and To Love a Patty. I do not want this. I do not want to see Patrick or especially SpongeBob in any kind of romantic encounter. Obviously, I do not control the show, so I can't dictate what the writers do, but this is just a plot point I simply do not enjoy because of my own preferences. Moving on, once SpongeBob emerges from the tanning bed, Sun Bleached, which is not a thing by the way, and once the two friends talk to Squidward, the scene just again feels boring. Squidward laughing at SpongeBob does nothing for me, and it just goes on for too long, especially when he predictably opens the window to do so, and maybe I'm feeling this way because the episode has already been ruined for me because of its unfortunate implications and inclusions. I'll fully admit to this, but the fact is I'm not enjoying what I'm watching. When Patrick decides to give SpongeBob a makeover, this is definitely an improvement entertainment-wise, being slightly more enjoyable than everything that has come before it, and when the mother beats up SpongeBob, I actually huff out a little bit of a laugh at that, even though I still feel bad for SpongeBob in the end. Although Patrick caused the entire issue in the first place, I do appreciate his determination to get SpongeBob to the party, and how he ends up coming up with a solution involving caramel, a solution that is then ruined later, of course. Finally, we reach the party. This segment is fine. Again, nothing much to say other than I get some residual enjoyment from the meme potential of the tan meter used to deny or allow entry, but that itself is also related to my big soapbox rant, so it's a whole lot of complicated feelings there. I also like the animations of SpongeBob and Patrick dancing, they're so silly. Patrick is very unhelpful once again, and SpongeBob's caramel facade cracks, revealing his sun-bleached skin. But luckily for him, this bleaching is praised by Craig Mamelton himself. And see, despite what you might think, I don't mind this part of the episode, with the very obvious way it parodies tanning culture and people who don't put on sunscreen. At least, kind of. See, I've seen some people on the SpongeBob wiki saying that this episode promotes bad sun protection habits, and even my past self thought this, though I think that was because at the time I lacked the language needed to describe my real problem with this episode. But, I think it's very clear that this episode was parodying those bad habits and showing how ridiculous they are to a certain extent. So I will at least defend this aspect of the episode. And this would actually be a decent lesson to have for an episode, and the dangers of UV exposure would be a decent episode topic for any show that isn't this one. And I'll get to why when I talk about that part shortly. As it is, Sun Bleached is just a very dull episode with a few good jokes. It also has the very unfortunate characteristic of being built around a story and topic I am deeply uncomfortable with being brought up in this show specifically, as I will explain in the next timestamp. So basically, this episode is a good fit for my barely tolerable tier, where it comes in with a score of 4.7 out of 10. Without the big issue I have with this one, it probably would have been just fine and mediocre, but that issue just poisons this episode from the inside out for me. And now it's about time that I talk about that big issue. Okay, first things first, this opinion is closed to comments. I really and truly do not want to hear it unless you want to have a legitimate conversation surrounding what I'm about to say. So if you're about to say that I'm overreacting, being unreasonable, or this, that, and the third, you can keep it to yourself. If you've read this review on SpongeBob Mania, you'll probably notice that parts of this section are much different, and that I've added a lot of new stuff. That is because it's been a year and a half since I wrote the original review of this episode, and I've been able to find the words for things that I couldn't even then, able to get my thoughts together more. I wrote the review to that episode sitting on a bench in undergrad waiting for my next class to start. I write the script to this review sitting at my job in grad school. I've had time to think about this. So, here it is. Sun Bleached, as an episode, is sadly, unfortunately, and frustrating anti-black. Or rather, it contains anti-black elements. And because of this, it ruins the escapist fantasy that it's supposed to be, and serves to alienate parts of the audience. Allow me to explain. Alright, so first, I know that anti-black is a big scary word, as it both should and shouldn't be. It should be something taken seriously, because it is serious, but it should not be something one gets defensive over, especially in this case because, I'm not even directing this critique at anyone, so no one should get defensive. But anyway, simply put, this episode's fixation on tanning is a problem. In the real world, that industry is inherently anti-black. But Pugs, tanning is about making your skin darker. How can it be anti-black, you may ask? Excellent question. See, tanning is about white people making their skin dark, just bronze actually, which is light-skinned according to any standard that takes into account darker skin tones, but not too dark. It's about taking elements of black appearance, thinking of how the definition of white as a racial identity is defined by not being black, without actually having to deal with any of the structural issues that actual black people have to face, commodification of the black aesthetic and all that. In a certain sense, because of course, like I already said, only light-skinned black people have the skin tone that white people are tanning for, but I digress. Of course, this episode exaggerates things for the purpose of parody and comedy. This doesn't make things any better for a reason I'll get to in a second. It just leaves a bad taste in my mouth, for starters. And of course, the final form, the most coveted form, of the tanning in this episode is literally bleached skin. The jokes write themselves at this point. Just to be clear, you cannot bleach your skin through sun exposure, so it's really funny that this is what was went with here. And no, I don't think anyone even remotely thought of the colorist skin bleaching industry. I'm sure they got this idea from the way that sun exposure fades objects or something. But it's just funny that this is what happened here. Anyway, back to my main point. So the biggest reason I have such a problem with this episode is that it racializes the show, plain and simple, because as I've already stated, the tanning industry operates under the assumption that your natural skin tone is pale. A dark-skinned person will never be seen as someone with an attractive tan. Additionally, even for lighter-skinned people of color, because of colorism, getting darker is seen as a negative thing. So Tanning has a much different connotation in other communities, and I'm simplifying a lot here. And none of this is to say that black people can't tan, because we can and do, but we don't benefit from the industry like white people do because we don't meet the beauty standards of the industry. At the end of the day, white people with a tan are still white. So for the fish in this episode to be engaging in tanning, it's not a good look for me. Instead of just enjoying a show about technicolor fish, those fish have now been implicitly racialized as white. They are white-coded, as it were. That is a better way to frame it, because racialize is a term meant to apply to non-white people for a whole bunch of reasons I'm not going to get into. So anyway, the fish are white-coded, and now I'm forced to think about real-world problems, and that upsets me greatly. And let me speak more about this implicit white coding, because there's more to say. That the fish have now been coded as white, all the fish mind you, now brings in the real-world context of the normalization of whiteness and white appearance into the show. Think of it like this. If you were to humanize the characters in this show, what would they look like? And I mean making the characters, including the background fish, realistic humans. I'm willing to bet for most, especially for y'all who live in the US like I do, you're imagining a lot of white people. That's what I'm talking about. Whiteness is seen as the norm, as the prototypical identity. Everything else is additive and different. This is one of the many ways racism operates. Now, I want you all to hold on to that thought for a second while I bring up something else. Another problem I have with this episode is that I don't like the way that the message about sun protection, which is relevant to everybody no matter their skin tone, is conjoined with the parodying of tanning culture, because it shuts out those of us who do not benefit from tanning culture. In other words, those of us who aren't white, from the lesson. It feels like it isn't meant for us. It makes the episode, and by extension the show, feel like it's not meant for me. That's what this kind of shit does, including the implicit white coding of the characters. It makes you feel singled out, like you're different, like you're other. This episode otherizes non-white people and black people specifically, and I'm not going to pretend like it doesn't. From a show like SpongeBob SquarePants, where the characters aren't even human, this is especially, insulting, hurtful, unexpected. Everyone here is probably familiar with conversations surrounding representation in media. Without offering too much commentary on those conversations, I think what most of them miss, and they have multiple reasons for doing this, is that it goes beyond just seeing yourself in media. It's also important to be represented in the intended audience, to be considered in the intended audience, and black people like myself were not considered. That's why this episode upsets me, because I can see that. I can feel that. It is glaringly obvious to me. This entire episode idea should have been scrapped. If they wanted to make an episode about the importance of protecting oneself from the sun, they should have done that and made this episode about sunscreen, not tanning. There's just too much real-life baggage here. I feel like I've been otherized by my favorite show. Like, I've gotten this reminder that, oh yeah, society fucking hates me. Watching Sun Bleached makes me uncomfortable and robs me of an escape for this exact reason. That is almost unforgivable. And while I've got your attention, let me address the defensive response I can already feel, even though I told y'all to keep that shit to yourselves. Why are you making this about race? I don't like that argument. I've never liked that argument because it ignores reality. Everything in this world, and especially in the US, which is where I live, is about race. Hate to break it to you. Though honestly, everything in this world is at the very least about skin color, because colorism exists everywhere and it existed before the concept of race did, and thus the points I'm making here still stand, even if I'm looking at it from a US-centric lens. But anyway, that is how global history has played out. And for this episode specifically, it has a topic that has very clear racial undertones to me. Maybe it isn't obvious to you, and that's fair. I tend to notice these things, that's just how I am, but I'm not hurting anybody by talking about my thoughts and feelings about this episode, and if you're butthurt, then I suggest you find yourself a new reviewer to watch, because not only are you not receiving any apologies from me, but I'm sure that this isn't the last time I'll be discussing something of this nature. Oh, and also I saw a little bit of this on the SpongeBob wiki, but no, I don't think this episode is reverse racism. That's just asinine and bullshit, and I don't even have time to begin covering why that's wrong, other than to say that reverse racism does not exist. Now, I wanted to end things on a relatively lighter note. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that every single thing I've just mentioned in this big soapbox rant is incidental and not purposeful. I highly, highly doubt that the writer's room was full of people who wanted to include anti-black elements in the episode and make non-white people feel otherized. I highly doubt that they even wanted to racially code the characters, which again goes to show that whiteness is the norm. But the fact is, this happened. Or at least it happened to me. I'm not sure how many people feel similarly, since you don't usually see in-depth critical race thought on SpongeBob SquarePants. And I don't blame the writers for living in an anti-black society and therefore including these biases in their products, but I do believe it is their responsibility to have people in the room who can catch these things. This is the result of an all-white writer's room, nothing else to it, and that's all I've got to say on that.